The bustling terminal at New York's JFK Airport hummed with the familiar sounds of rolling suitcases, the rhythmic cadence of flight announcements, and the soft buzz of travelers immersed in their own worlds. Among the crowd, the Thompson family moved with a quiet purpose, their steps aligned in an unspoken harmony. David Thompson led the way, his back straight and his stride steady. His presence commanded respect without effort, a natural calm that seemed to create a bubble of stillness around him amid the chaos. Maria walked slightly behind him, her hand resting gently on their young daughter Ella's shoulder. Her eyes, sharp and ever watchful, darted between the crowd and her family, a constant assessment of their surroundings. She moved with a practiced grace, a protective aura that balanced David's quiet strength. Her expression softened only when she looked at Ella, a small, reassuring smile that spoke volumes of love and safety. Ella, a petite 6-year-old with wild curls and bright, curious eyes, clutched a colorful toy airplane in her small hands. She was the embodiment of innocence, her world still wrapped in the joy of make-believe and childhood wonder. As they approached the security checkpoint, she tilted her head up to Maria. "Mommy, are we going on a real airplane like this?" she asked, holding up her toy. "Yes, baby," Maria replied, her voice a soothing melody amidst the background noise. "Just like that." The family stood out not because of their appearance, but because of the palpable connection between them. They seemed unshakable, a trio bound by love and an unspoken resilience. Yet beneath their composed exterior, there was a subtle tension, an awareness that even a simple journey could become complicated, not because of anything they did, but because of who they were. Ella's fingers danced along the wings of her toy airplane, pressing a button that made it light up and emit a cheerful whoosh. She giggled softly, the sound drawing a few passing smiles from fellow travelers. Her joy was a bright spot in the sea of hurried faces, a reminder that innocence could thrive even in a world filled with complexities. Maria tightened her hold on Ella's shoulder, the motion as natural as breathing. Her eyes remained vigilant, scanning the faces around them. It wasn't paranoia, more like a well-honed instinct. She had learned long ago that the world did not always greet families like theirs with open arms. But she also knew that her strength was Ella's shield, her poise, the family's compass. David led them with a quiet confidence, his every step deliberate. He moved with the ease of a man who knew his place in the world, despite the world often questioning it. His tailored jacket and polished shoes spoke of success, but his demeanor was free of arrogance. He was the kind of man who drew attention without asking for it, whose calm suggested a depth not immediately visible. As they reached the gate, the family shared a moment of stillness. David knelt to Ella's level, his voice soft yet firm. "Are you ready for your adventure, sweetheart?" Ella nodded eagerly, her curls bouncing. "Yes, Daddy. Can I sit by the window?" Maria chuckled, the sound light and genuine. "You can have the best seat in the house," she promised. The exchange was brief but rich with warmth, a snapshot of their dynamic. It was clear that this was a family that loved deeply and stood firmly together. As they handed their boarding passes to the agent, their unity shone through. A small, unwavering light as they embarked on what they thought would be a peaceful journey. As the Thompson family approached the gate, the atmosphere seemed to shift subtly, like a breeze that brought a sudden chill. The crowd thinned, and as they stepped into the priority boarding line, a few heads turned. It wasn't the warm, curious glance shared among travelers, but rather the kind of look that lingered, a moment too long, questioning, weighing, and judging without words. David remained unbothered, his calm demeanor unwavering. He exchanged a polite nod with an older couple nearby, their expressions neutral but their conversation halting as he passed. Maria felt the shift too, her senses finely tuned to these undercurrents. She pulled Ella a little closer, brushing a stray curl from her daughter's forehead. The motion was gentle, a mother's touch, but beneath it lay a silent, unspoken promise. "I am here. I will protect you." At the gate, the agent, a woman in her mid-30s with a practiced smile, greeted them. Her expression was warm until her eyes dropped to their boarding passes. Her fingers hesitated over the scanner, the movement almost imperceptible, but enough to draw Maria's attention. The woman's gaze flickered between the tickets and the Thompsons, a fleeting shadow of doubt passing across her face. "Is everything all right?" David's voice was smooth, neither accusatory nor defensive, just a simple question laced with quiet strength. "Oh yes, of course." The agent's smile widened, but it strained at the edges. "I just need a moment to verify." Her voice trailed off as she tapped at the screen, the seconds stretching uncomfortably. Behind the Thompsons, the line began to shift, passengers craning to see what the holdup was. Ella, blissfully unaware, leaned against Maria's leg, her toy airplane gliding through the air in slow, swooping circles. The innocence of her playfulness was a stark contrast to the tension building around them. Finally, the scanner beeped, and the gate agent's shoulders relaxed. "All set. Have a wonderful flight." Her tone was back to its scripted cheerfulness, but the moment had already left its mark. Maria caught David's eye, a silent exchange passing between them. This wasn't new. It was just another moment added to the quiet collection of experiences they carried with them. Those small, insidious reminders that not everyone saw them as they saw themselves. David gently guided his family forward, his hand a steady anchor. They moved past the threshold, into the boarding tunnel, where the hum of the plane's engine became a low, constant vibration beneath their feet. But even as they walked toward their seats, Maria couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Something hung in the air, an unspoken tension, waiting for its chance to unravel. Jessica Parker moved through the first-class cabin with a practiced smile, her polished demeanor a veneer of professionalism. Her uniform was immaculate, every crease sharp, every button perfectly aligned. She had done this 1,000 times before, welcoming passengers, offering assistance, and ensuring comfort. But as her gaze landed on the Thompsons, a flicker of something crossed her face, gone almost as quickly as it appeared, but not fast enough to escape Maria's watchful eyes. The Thompsons had just settled into their seats. Ella was already pressing her nose against the window, the small airplane toy clutched in her hand as if it might somehow help her understand the real one outside. Maria fastened Ella's seatbelt with gentle fingers, while David arranged their carry-on in the overhead compartment, his movements smooth and unhurried. "Excuse me." Jessica's voice cut through the hum of the boarding music, crisp and controlled. Her smile remained, but it was tight, the corners held by willpower more than warmth. "May I see your boarding passes again?" David turned slowly, a mild surprise lifting his eyebrows. "Of course." He reached into his jacket, producing the passes with the same calm he'd shown at the gate. He offered them to Jessica, his expression open, unbothered by the request. Jessica examined the tickets, her eyes narrowing just a fraction. The camera might have missed it, but the Thompsons didn't. Her thumb traced the embossed lettering, her lips pressed into a thin line. She seemed to be looking for something beyond the seat numbers, something that would validate her doubt. "Is there a problem?" Maria asked, her tone as soft as ever, but with a thread of steel woven through it. Ella looked up, her small face a perfect mirror of her mother's concern. Jessica's smile widened, though her eyes did not. "No, not at all, just a routine check." She handed the passes back, her fingers lingering a moment too long. "If you need anything, please don't hesitate to ask." As she moved on to the next row, the atmosphere she left behind was noticeably cooler. David slid back into his seat, his expression thoughtful. Maria exhaled slowly, her hand brushing Ella's curls, as if grounding them both. "It's fine," David murmured, his voice a steadying presence. "Just let it go." Maria nodded, but her grip on Ella's hand remained firm. And though the plane continued to fill with the usual bustle of travelers finding their seats, the Thompson family sat cocooned in a bubble of unease, a fragile calm over still waters that hinted at the storm beneath. From the back of the cabin, Grace watched the exchange between Jessica and the Thompsons. She had seen that look on Jessica's face before, a blend of doubt and quiet suspicion that made the air feel colder. Grace had joined the airline only a year ago, still fresh enough to believe in the training about treating every passenger with respect. She had thought it was a given, a simple rule to follow, until she saw how easily biases could slip through the cracks. Grace moved closer, her steps quiet, her expression open and welcoming. She saw the way Maria's fingers curled protectively around Ella's small hand, the subtle tension in David's posture as he leaned slightly forward, a human shield. She offered them a genuine smile, one that reached her eyes and softened the edges of the moment. "Hi there," she said gently, her voice a soft contrast to Jessica's earlier clipped tone. "Is there anything I can get you before takeoff? Maybe a blanket for your little one?" Maria's shoulders eased just a fraction. "Thank you. That would be lovely." Grace nodded and glanced at Ella, who was still absorbed in her toy airplane. "Do you like flying?" she asked, crouching slightly to be on the girl's level. Ella looked up, her curls bouncing. "Yes, we're going to see the ocean. It's my first time." "That sounds amazing," Grace replied, her enthusiasm genuine. "You know, from up here, the ocean looks like a giant blue blanket. I think you'll love it." The exchange was brief but transformative. The warmth of Grace's presence seemed to dissolve some of the ice left behind by Jessica. She moved on to retrieve the blanket, but not before casting a glance back at Jessica, who stood. Jessica noticed. Her lips pressed tighter and her fingers wrapped around the handle of the drink cart with a grip too firm. Grace's quiet defiance, her gentle approach to the Thompsons, felt like an unspoken challenge. The dynamic between the two flight attendants hung in the air, a tension woven into every polite smile and subtle exchange. It was as if the cabin itself could feel the shift, the first stirrings of a conflict that had yet to fully emerge but was already impossible to ignore. As Jessica moved back up the aisle, the atmosphere in the first-class cabin shifted. Conversations that had once been soft and casual now turned into hushed whispers. The subtle rustle of newspapers lowering and the sideways glances from behind tablet screens created an unspoken ripple through the cabin. An older man in a crisp gray suit glanced over his glasses, his lips pressed into a thin line. A woman 2 rows back, who had been tapping away on her laptop, paused mid-keystroke, her fingers frozen in mid-air. The tension was a living thing, snaking its way through the cabin, curling around the seats and tightening with every passing moment. Jessica, still clutching the Thompson's boarding passes, approached the service phone near the galley. She turned slightly away from the passengers, her voice low but the urgency unmistakable. "Yes, I need a verification on a first-class booking. The Thompson family. No, I don't see them listed on the manifest. Can you double-check?" Her fingers tapped rhythmically on the counter, each tap echoing a drumbeat of doubt. The murmurs among the passengers grew, a soft hum of shared uncertainty. One woman leaned toward her travel companion, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do you think is going on? Did they sneak into first class?" Her companion, a man with salt and pepper hair and a book half closed in his lap, shook his head. "I don't know. They seem fine to me. It's probably nothing." But even his voice lacked conviction. The passengers sat on the edge of a threshold, unsure whether to dismiss the situation or lean into their unease. The plane had not yet left the ground, but already it felt as though they were suspended in a kind of turbulence, not of air, but of perception. Back in their seats, Maria and David remained still. Maria's hand rested on Ella's knee, a gesture of comfort as much for herself as for her daughter. David's face was a mask of calm, but his eyes held a storm. He knew how quickly perceptions could shift, how easily an ordinary family could become a focal point of suspicion. Jessica finished her call, her expression unreadable as she hung up. She turned back toward the Thompsons, and the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if this would pass as a harmless misunderstanding, or if it was the beginning of something much more unsettling. Jessica returned to the Thompsons' row, her expression fixed in a practiced smile that never reached her eyes. She held their boarding passes with a delicate pinch, as if the very paper might somehow validate her suspicions. Her voice dropped to a level meant to sound professional, but landed somewhere between condescension and accusation. "I'm sorry, but I need to ask you a few more questions regarding your tickets," Jessica said, her tone threaded with an edge. "Can I see a form of identification to confirm these seats?" David's calm remained unshaken. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out their IDs with the same deliberate care as before. His movements were smooth, controlled, a stark contrast to the stiffness in Jessica's stance. "Of course," he said evenly, offering the cards without hesitation. Maria's posture tightened, her hand finding Ella's, their fingers intertwining. She exchanged a glance with David, a quiet conversation passing between them, one of endurance, of patience, of a battle they knew too well. They had been here before, in different places, with different faces, but always the same script. Jessica examined their IDs, her eyes flicking up to meet David's gaze, then shifting to Maria. Her smile hardened, the polite mask slipping to reveal a hint of her true feelings. "And are these your actual seats? Did you, perhaps, pick up the wrong passes at the gate?" Maria's lips parted, a sharp inhale that she reined in quickly. Her voice, when it came, was a soft but firm echo of David's calm. "We were assigned these seats, and our tickets were verified at the gate." The atmosphere around them tightened, a taut string pulled to its limit. Jessica hesitated, caught between her need to assert control and the growing discomfort from the surrounding passengers. She handed back the IDs, her fingers brushing David's a moment longer than necessary, as if still searching for the discrepancy that only existed in her mind. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice losing its edge but not its chill. "If you need anything, let me know." She moved away, but the weight of her suspicion lingered, settling over the Thompsons like an unwelcome shadow. Jessica stepped into the small enclosed galley, her back to the first-class cabin. She picked up the service phone, her fingers tapping rapidly on the keypad, as if urgency alone could validate her suspicions. She turned her body slightly away, but her posture remained rigid, every movement infused with an unspoken resolve. "Hi, this is Jessica Parker on Flight 237, she began, her voice lowered but still sharp. "I need you to double-check a first-class booking under the name Thompson. Yes, that's right, David, Maria, and a child, Ella. Can you confirm if they're supposed to be here?" She listened, her lips pressed into a thin line. Her free hand clutched the countertop, knuckles pale against the polished metal. The pause on the other end of the line seemed to stretch, and for a moment, the bustling sounds of the cabin receded, leaving only the steady thrum of the plane's engine beneath her feet. "Hold on," the voice on the other end said, a note of confusion slipping through. "The Thompsons were booked weeks ago. Their tickets were flagged VIP by the corporate office. Everything looks perfectly in order." Jessica's brow furrowed. "Are you sure? There's nothing unusual about the booking? No discrepancies?" Another pause, longer this time. When the voice returned, it was not only clear but also unmistakably professional. "I suggest you take another look at your passenger manifest. The Thompsons are exactly where they should be. In fact, if I were you, I'd make sure everything on your end is in perfect order." Jessica's grip on the phone tightened. "Who am I speaking with?" she asked, a slight tremor slipping into her voice. "This is Sarah, Mr. Thompson's executive assistant," came the reply, smooth as glass. "If you have any further questions, I suggest you bring them directly to your supervisor. I'll be sure to let Mr. Thompson know of your concern." The line went dead before Jessica could respond. She stood there, the phone still pressed to her ear, the plastic cool against her skin. Her mind raced, the pieces not quite fitting together. She hung up slowly, her movements mechanical, and turned back to the cabin. Her carefully maintained facade was beginning to crack, a faint but unmistakable shift in her expression. She straightened her uniform, smoothed her hair, and forced her feet to move. but each step back toward the Thompsons felt heavier, as if she were walking against a rising tide. Maria's voice was barely a whisper, but in the quiet of their row, it sounded as sharp as a crack in glass. "This isn't right." David remained still, his posture relaxed, yet there was a tension in the way his hands rested on his knees, fingers curled slightly, as if holding back an impulse. He didn't look at Maria when he responded, his voice a low murmur meant only for her ears. "Because they think we don't belong." The truth of his words hung between them, a weight neither wanted but both were forced to carry. It was a truth they had known in small, subtle ways all their lives, through lingering stares at fancy restaurants, extra scrutiny in department stores, and now, in the close confines of a plane, where every glance felt like a question. Maria's grip on Ella tightened, a gentle squeeze meant to ground them both. Ella had stopped playing, her small fingers clutching the toy airplane so hard that her knuckles turned white. Her wide eyes moved between her parents, picking up on the things they weren't saying. She was young, but not too young to understand that something was wrong. The easy excitement she had felt about the trip had slipped away, leaving behind a quiet, unsettling confusion. "Mommy?" she asked, her voice small. "Are we still going to see the ocean?" Maria's expression softened instantly, the warmth of her smile a practiced response to shield her daughter. "Of course, baby. Nothing's going to stop us." David reached over, his hand resting on top of Maria's, their fingers intertwining. The touch was brief but full of meaning. They had been here before, in this space of quiet endurance. Their strength lay not in avoiding these moments, but in weathering them together, presenting a united front that no one could break. A few rows back, Grace watched them, her expression unreadable but her empathy clear. She saw the way Maria's shoulders tensed, the way David's jaw set just a little too tight, the way Ella's small body folded into itself, as if trying to disappear. Grace had seen passengers uncomfortable before, but this was different. This was the discomfort of being made to feel out of place, of having to justify your presence in a space where you had every right to be. The plane was still grounded, but already the journey felt longer, heavier. The hum of the cabin, the shuffle of passengers settling in, and the polite exchanges between other flight attendants and travelers all served as a stark contrast to the bubble of stillness around the Thompsons. It was as if they existed in a different air, thicker and more difficult to breathe. David glanced around the cabin, his expression calm but his eyes searching. He wasn't looking for confrontation but for understanding. For someone, anyone, to see what was happening and acknowledge it. But most of the passengers had returned to their own worlds, eyes on screens or turned away, unwilling to see the discomfort unfolding in their midst. He turned back to Maria and Ella, his voice a steady anchor in the storm. "We're okay. We're right where we're supposed to be." And with those words, he rebuilt the small bubble of safety around his family, a fragile but powerful barrier against the world outside. Jessica approached with a forced smile, every step a study in controlled precision. Her hands clasped in front of her, fingers interlocked so tightly that her knuckles blanched. Her demeanor was polished, but there was an edge to her presence, a sharpness that cut through the steady hum of the cabin. "Mr. Thompson," she began, her voice laced with a politeness that felt like a thin veil over something harsher. "I'm so sorry to bother you again, but there seems to be a mix-up with your seating. I'm going to have to ask you and your family to move to the main cabin while we sort this out." Her words hung in the air, each syllable carefully measured, but the intent was clear. This was not a request, it was an attempt to exert control. Her gaze did not waver, but beneath the surface there was a tremor, a faint ripple of insecurity. David remained still, his expression a mask of calm. His voice, when he spoke, was gentle but firm. "We've shown our boarding passes and you verified them. What seems to be the problem?" Jessica's smile tightened, the corners of her mouth straining to maintain their curve. "It's just protocol. I assure you, it's nothing personal." Her eyes darted to the surrounding passengers, and it was clear she knew they were listening. Maria's hand moved instinctively to Ella's shoulder, her touch both protective and steadying. Ella, who had been watching her toy airplane as if it held the answers, looked up, her wide eyes reflecting the confusion she could not yet articulate. From a few rows back, Grace stood near the galley, her expression a blend of concern and disbelief. She exchanged a glance with a fellow flight attendant, but neither moved. The tension seemed to have roots, twisting and spreading, holding everyone in place. A murmur swept through the cabin, not loud but enough to shift the energy. An older woman with a neat bun leaned closer to her husband, her whisper barely audible. "Why are they asking them to move? They were here first." A young man in a leather jacket shifted in his seat, his brow creased with something between curiosity and discomfort. The collective awareness grew, a quiet chorus of silent questions and stolen glances. David remained still, his voice unwavering. "I'd like a specific reason. Our tickets are for these seats. Unless there's a clear issue, we'll remain here." Jessica's mask slipped just a bit. Her grip tightened around the back of a nearby seat, her knuckles a stark white against the dark leather. She hesitated, the script she had rehearsed in her mind faltering under the weight of David's calm. Her authority, once a shield, now seemed fragile, translucent, cracking under the strain of the moment. We just need to verify your reservation with the main cabin staff," she said, but the words lacked their intended impact. Instead of an assertion of control, they sounded more like a plea for compliance. The cabin seemed to hold its breath, the passengers waiting to see what would happen next. Some turned away, unwilling to engage, but others sat forward, their eyes keen, recognizing that this was more than just a seating issue. It was a confrontation, not just of tickets and protocol, but of dignity and respect. Grace moved quietly toward Jessica, her expression open but her steps deliberate. She had seen enough to know this situation was spiraling, the thread of professionalism unraveling with each pointed question. Her voice was soft when she spoke, careful not to add to the growing tension. "Jessica," she began, her tone gentle, "I just rechecked the manifest. The Thompsons are listed exactly where they should be. Their tickets are confirmed for first class." Jessica's shoulders stiffened, her fingers still clamped around the seat back, as if anchoring herself. She didn't turn fully toward Grace, only a partial pivot that felt dismissive. "I appreciate your input, Grace, but this is a protocol issue. I need to handle it." Grace's brow knitted slightly, a small crease of concern. "But the protocol has been followed. Their boarding passes were scanned, their IDs checked. There's no discrepancy." Jessica's expression tightened, the polite mask slipping just enough to reveal the frustration beneath. "I'll decide when the protocol has been followed. If you could please attend to the other passengers, I'd appreciate it." For a moment, Grace hesitated, a shadow of indecision passing over her face. Then, with a small nod, she stepped back, but her eyes remained on the Thompsons. She was not retreating, not entirely, just repositioning, staying within sight, a quiet presence that might yet shift the balance. The first-class cabin felt smaller, the air heavier. The passengers, once engrossed in their own lives, now sat on the edge of an invisible boundary, torn between polite detachment and the pull of unfolding drama. An older couple exchanged a look, the woman's lips pressed into a thin line. A businessman in the aisle seat glanced over his tablet, the screen dimming as his attention shifted fully to the scene ahead. The whispers grew, soft enough to maintain decorum, but loud enough to amplify the unease. "Why won't she leave them alone?" someone muttered, the voice too low to pinpoint, but clear enough to resonate. A younger woman leaned toward her partner, her expression a mix of discomfort and curiosity. "Do you think they did something wrong?" she asked, her voice barely more than a breath. Her partner shook his head, his face a study in conflict. "I don't know. It just doesn't feel right." The murmurs rippled through the cabin, a wave of shared uncertainty. Some passengers averted their eyes, preferring to sink into the safety of their screens or the folds of their blankets. Others watched openly, their gazes darting between Jessica and the Thompsons, waiting to see what would happen next. In the midst of it all, David remained still, his composure a sharp contrast to the subtle chaos around him. Maria's hand rested gently on Ella's shoulder, her touch a steady reminder of safety. And Ella, her wide eyes reflecting the tension, clung to her toy airplane, her small world shrinking to the reassuring feel of its plastic wings beneath her fingers. David remained seated, his posture relaxed but his expression unyielding. His hand moved slowly, deliberately, as he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. The motion was calm, devoid of any theatrics, yet it commanded attention. The murmurs in the cabin quieted, a ripple of silence spreading outward as if the air itself was holding its breath. He tapped the screen with a practiced ease, his thumb moving in a steady rhythm. The phone rested lightly in his hand, a tool rather than a weapon, but the weight of the moment was undeniable. Jessica stood frozen, her polite facade cracking under the strain of uncertainty. She clutched her clipboard, the edges of the laminated pages biting into her fingers. David's voice, when it came, was soft but carried through the quiet. "Yes, this is David Thompson. I need to speak to the executive office, please." His words were casual, as if he were ordering coffee rather than unraveling a situation thick with tension. Jessica's face paled. The name hung in the air, a drop of ink spreading through water. Her lips moved, forming a silent question, but no sound escaped. She had been so certain, so sure of her position, but now the ground beneath her seemed to shift, the solid surface of her authority crumbling into sand. David continued, his voice unwavering. "Yes, I'm on flight 237. There appears to be an issue with our seating arrangement. I'd appreciate it if you could clarify to the flight staff that our tickets are not only valid, but that we belong exactly where we are." He paused, listening to the voice on the other end. "Thank you. I'll hold." The passengers around them sat motionless, their curiosity now sharpened into a keen awareness that they were witnessing something significant. Even those who had turned away earlier now found their gazes drawn back, like iron filings to a magnet. Jessica managed to find her voice, though it trembled as she spoke. "Mr. Thompson, I assure you, this is just a misunderstanding. If you'd allow me a moment, I can—" David's eyes met hers, calm and unblinking. "A misunderstanding?" His tone was not accusatory, but carried a weight that made every word land heavily. "Then let's clear it up together." He held her gaze, his expression unchanged, but beneath his calm lay an unyielding strength. The phone crackled, and David's expression softened slightly. "Yes, thank you, I appreciate that." He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket, his movements as composed as ever. Jessica's mask of professionalism had all but shattered. Her breathing quickened, a subtle but unmistakable shift that betrayed her growing fear. The clipboard in her hands trembled, the pages whispering against each other. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words seemed to tangle, a knot of excuses and apologies that never found their way out. David leaned back in his seat, his expression unreadable. "I think we've all had enough confusion for one day. My family and I will remain in our seats." His voice carried not just authority, but a profound assurance, a reminder to everyone present that respect was not something to be negotiated. Jessica took a step back, her world narrowing as the full weight of the situation pressed down on her. The balance of power had shifted, and in that shift her role had transformed, from enforcer to observer, from certainty to doubt. And all the while David remained still, his presence a quiet storm that needed no thunder to be felt. Maria's voice trembled, a fragile thread woven through the heavy silence. Her lips moved slowly, as if every word carried the weight of a lifetime. "How many times do we have to prove we belong?" The question wasn't just for David. It wasn't even just for Jessica. It lingered in the air, settling over every passenger, echoing into the quiet corners of the cabin. It was a question for anyone who had ever felt their worth measured by someone else's bias, who had stood in spaces where acceptance came with strings attached. A single tear traced a path down Maria's cheek, a glistening line against the strength of her expression. She didn't wipe it away. She let it be, a silent testament to the pain and resilience intertwined within her. Ella, still clutching her toy airplane, looked up at her mother, sensing the shift but too young to fully understand. She reached out, her small hand brushing the cool wetness on Maria's cheek, her touch both innocent and grounding. David remained steady, his hand resting on Maria's shoulder. His silence spoke volumes, a shared burden, a quiet vow. His strength wasn't just in his calm, but in his unwavering presence, an anchor in the storm of prejudice that had blown through their day. His family was his truth, and in this moment, he was their shield. Around them, the cabin was still. Some passengers stared openly, their expressions a mixture of sympathy and guilt. Others looked away, their discomfort palpable, as if the truth in Maria's words burned too brightly to face. The older gentleman, who had been watching from a few rows back, leaned over to his wife, his voice a quiet rumble. "We should say something." She nodded, her lips pressed together, a resolve forming where hesitation had been. Grace stood at the edge of the scene, her own eyes shining with unshed tears. She had come forward, inch by inch, as if drawn by an invisible force. Her presence was a reminder that empathy could bridge the gap, that it only took one person willing to stand with the truth to shift the narrative. For those watching this story, both on the plane and beyond, there was a call to action, not of bold declarations, but of quiet courage. It was a moment to reflect on their own lives, to consider the times they had felt out of place, unseen, or questioned for simply being who they were. And it was an invitation to share, to connect, to find solidarity in shared experiences. To everyone who has ever felt like they needed to prove they belonged, this story is for you. It is for the moments you stood still when the world pushed against you, for the times you held your ground when your place was questioned. If this story resonates with you, share your story, add your voice, because the more voices join the chorus, the louder the truth will become. And in that truth lies the power to change the story for the next person who finds themselves in a moment like this. A murmur began at the back of the cabin, a low hum that slowly gathered strength. It moved through the rows like a gentle wave, passengers turning to one another, sharing glances that were no longer just curious, but questioning. The silence that had once been a shield of polite detachment started to break, allowing room for voices that had remained quiet for too long. A man in his 40s, wearing a navy blazer and wire-rimmed glasses, cleared his throat. His voice, though soft, cut through the stillness. "This isn't right," he said, his words carefully measured. "I've seen this happen before, not on a plane, but in a boardroom. Different setting, same feeling." His admission hung in the air, and he shifted slightly, his hands clasping the armrests as if grounding himself. "I know what it's like to be made to feel like you don't belong." The woman next to him, an elderly lady with silver hair and kind eyes, leaned forward. Her fingers twisted a delicate silk scarf, the fabric a bright contrast against her pale hands. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I saw what was happening, and I didn't say anything. I thought if I stayed quiet I wouldn't make things worse, but silence is its own kind of wrong." Her confession seemed to unlock a door. The young couple who had been whispering earlier now sat openly, turned toward the Thompsons, their expressions a blend of support and regret. The businessman with the tablet lowered it fully, his attention focused solely on the unfolding scene. The cabin, once a patchwork of isolated moments, began to feel like a shared space, a community waking up to the truth around them. Grace stepped forward, her movements gentle but deliberate. She stood next to the Thompsons, her posture a quiet but powerful statement. "I want to apologize as well," she said, her voice clear. "I should have done more. I tried to say something earlier, but I didn't push hard enough. That changes now." Jessica, who had remained near the galley, looked smaller somehow. The authority she had wielded now seemed like a costume, something that didn't quite fit. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. The weight of the passengers' shifting support pressed down on her, reshaping the power dynamics of the cabin. Maria's expression softened, a mix of relief and cautious hope. David nodded to Grace, the gesture a quiet acknowledgement of her courage. Ella, still clutching her toy airplane, seemed to sense the change. She turned to her mother, her voice a soft whisper. "Mommy, are we safe now?" "Yes, baby," Maria replied, her voice steady. "We are." The plane felt different. No longer a tight, uncomfortable space, but something more open, more human. The passengers had become more than just observers. They had chosen a side, and in doing so, they helped rebuild a sense of belonging that Jessica's actions had tried to fracture. And in the center of it all, the Thompsons sat as they always had, together, strong and undeniably where they belonged. Jessica stood near the galley, her back pressed against the cold metal of the service counter. The world around her had grown sharp and unsteady, as if the very air had turned brittle. Her hands, which had once moved with practiced precision, now trembled. The clipboard clutched against her chest like her authority, once a solid wall she could lean against, had crumbled. Each supportive word from the passengers felt like another brick pulled from beneath her feet, leaving her standing on nothing but the fragile remnants of her own assumptions. Her mind replayed every step of the confrontation, the doubts, the unnecessary questions, the tightening of her voice when she felt her control slipping. She had believed herself to be upholding protocol, but now, in the light of truth, that belief felt hollow, an echo of something twisted by her own unchecked bias. Jessica's face, usually a mask of professional detachment, bore the raw lines of fear and guilt. Her eyes darted from face to face, searching for a lifeline among the sea of witnesses to her mistake. But the passengers' gazes had turned from questioning to knowing, their expressions a mix of disappointment and quiet judgment. It was as if the plane itself had turned against her, the very aisles narrowing, the seats drawing closer, leaving her nowhere to hide. Her pulse drummed in her ears, a frantic beat that drowned out the ambient noise of the cabin. She tried to swallow, but her throat tightened, every breath a struggle. She opened her mouth to speak, to apologize, to explain. But what explanation could there be? Her own actions stood as evidence against her, a case she had built with every mistrustful glance and every unnecessary demand. Grace's presence beside the Thompsons was the final blow. The young flight attendant, who had tried to guide Jessica back from the edge, now stood firmly on the other side of the line. Her quiet defiance a stark contrast to a rush of heat flooded Jessica's cheeks, the sting of shame sharper than any reprimand she had ever faced. She thought of the phone call with the ground staff, of Sarah's voice, measured, confident, and now, in hindsight, a warning she had ignored. She had been so focused on proving herself right that she hadn't seen how wrong she had become. Jessica's vision blurred, not from tears, but from the realization that there would be consequences, real ones. She could already see the aftermath unfolding, the disciplinary meetings, the cold faces of executives who would listen to her story not with empathy but with the detachment of people protecting their brand. She was no longer the enforcer of rules, but the violator of them, a tragic figure brought low not by circumstance, but by her own hand. And in the quiet that followed, Jessica remained still, the world moving around her, a tide she could no longer control. A ripple of stillness moved through the cabin as Jessica approached the Thompsons' row. Her steps were slow, every inch of her posture weighed down by the gravity of her mistake. The clipboard that had once been a symbol of her authority now hung at her side, her grip on it loose, as if letting it go might somehow lighten her burden. Her voice, when she spoke, was small, stripped of the polished confidence she had worn like armor. "Mr. Thompson? Mrs. Thompson," she began, her gaze not quite meeting theirs. I want to apologize. There was no excuse for how I treated you. I made assumptions and I was wrong." The words wavered, but they were honest. Her face, drawn and pale, reflected not just the fear of consequences, but the sting of genuine remorse. It was as if the foundation beneath her had crumbled, leaving her exposed and vulnerable. The passengers watched, their earlier judgment tempered now by the quiet vulnerability in Jessica's tone. David's expression remained steady. He did not immediately respond, allowing the silence to settle around them. His pause was not meant to prolong her discomfort, but to ensure his words carried the weight of truth. When he spoke, his voice was calm but resonant. "Thank you for your apology. It takes courage to admit when you're wrong." A soft exhale moved through the cabin, a shared release of tension. Jessica's shoulders dropped slightly, the rigidity easing as if David's words had granted her permission to breathe again. But he wasn't finished. "It's important to understand," he continued, "that respect shouldn't depend on who someone is or what title they hold. It should be universal. My family deserves it, as does every passenger on this plane. As does every person you meet." The simplicity of his statement was its strength. He had turned the moment into a teaching, not just for Jessica, but for everyone within earshot. It was a reminder that dignity was not a privilege, but a right, an unspoken law that needed no uniform or clipboard to enforce. Jessica nodded, her throat tight with a mix of gratitude and shame. She had expected anger, even condemnation, but what she received was a gift, an opportunity to change, to rebuild herself not on power, but on compassion. As she stepped back, the lines between villain and victim blurred, leaving behind the image of a woman not defeated but quietly, humbly transformed. As the tension in the cabin softened, the murmur of quiet conversations began to fill the space. It was as if Jessica's apology had broken a seal, allowing not just relief but reflection to flow freely. Passengers turned to one another, their voices low, but the weight of their words unmistakable. An older woman with a kind, weathered face leaned toward the young couple beside her. "I've seen this before," she whispered, her fingers gently tracing the edge of her armrest. "Back when I was a girl, things weren't so different. You'd think we'd have learned by now." Her eyes, filled with the ache of too many years of silent witnessing, shone with a mix of regret and hope. The young man in the leather jacket, who had watched everything with a furrowed brow, now spoke softly to his companion. "I can't believe I didn't say something sooner. I felt it, knew it was wrong, but I just sat here." His voice trailed off, the unspoken question. Nearby, a middle-aged businessman folded his newspaper, his movements deliberate. "It takes a lot of strength to stay calm under pressure like that," he said, his tone thoughtful. "I'm not sure I could have done the same." His admission was met with nods, a ripple of acknowledgement that grace under fire was a rare and powerful thing. Grace moved quietly among the passengers, offering small comforts, a refill of water, an extra blanket, her presence a soothing balm over the frayed edges of the cabin's mood. When she reached the Thompsons, she paused, her expression open and sincere. "Thank you," she said simply. "Not just for how you handled this, but for showing all of us what it means to truly lead with dignity." David inclined his head, his eyes warm but clear. "We're just living our truth. It shouldn't have to be an act of courage to sit in the seats we paid for." Maria added, her voice soft but resonant, "We hope that by staying true to ourselves, it might make things easier for the next family. Maybe the next time, there won't even be a situation to handle." The passengers around them offered quiet affirmations, a few reaching out to shake David's hand or offer Maria a kind smile. The atmosphere, once strained and uncomfortable, now felt more like a shared space of learning. The plane, soaring high above the clouds, had become a small world of its own, one where understanding had begun to take root, nurtured by truth and the willingness to grow. Jessica sat alone in the quiet of the break room, the hum of the plane's engine a soft, steady backdrop. The other flight attendants moved past the door, their voices low, their steps careful. She knew they were avoiding her, and she couldn't blame them. Her clipboard sat on the table, abandoned, and in its place was a small, worn pamphlet titled Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, Building a Culture of Respect. Her hands smoothed over the cover, her fingertips tracing the creased edges. The pamphlet had been part of her training, a set of words and guidelines she had skimmed through once, more out of obligation than understanding. But now, each sentence seemed to hold weight, pressing down on her, filling the quiet with thoughts she couldn't easily escape. She read slowly, her lips moving soundlessly as if saying the words might make them sink deeper. She saw herself in the scenarios described, the unintentional biases, the small, seemingly harmless actions that could build walls where none were needed. The truth sat heavy in her chest, that she had been the barrier, that her assumptions had tried to draw a line where there should have only been an open door. A tear slipped down her cheek, quiet and warm. She didn't brush it away. It felt honest, a sign that the cracks in her composure were allowing something real to break through. She wasn't looking for redemption, not yet. She was still too close to the mistake, too raw from the reality of what she had done. But the pamphlet in her hands, the stillness around her, it was a start. A small, fragile step towards something better. The Thompson family walked down the jet bridge, the cool air of the terminal a soft welcome. At the end of the path, a small group of airline executives stood waiting, their faces open and earnest. David kept his expression calm, but there was a sense of resolve in his step, a quiet strength that had carried them through the storm. Maria held Ella's hand, their fingers intertwined. Ella's toy airplane still rested in her other hand, its bright colors a stark, hopeful contrast to the gray of the terminal walls. As they approached the executives, Ella lifted the toy high, her arm waving, the airplane dipping and gliding through the air. It was a child's simple joy, a gesture of play, but it was also a sign of something more, a future where flight meant freedom, where every journey began with an open path. One of the executives bent down, her smile genuine as she greeted Ella. "That's a beautiful airplane," she said, her tone light. "Where's it flying to?" Ella grinned, her curls bouncing as she answered, "Wherever it wants to go." The adults around her paused, the weight of her words settling softly. In that moment, the terminal felt less like a stop and more like a beginning. A place where change could take flight, guided by small hands and open hearts, led by the quiet, powerful truth of simply being who they were. A few weeks after the incident, the airline released a statement that rippled through the industry. It wasn't a brief apology or a hollow promise, but a concrete plan for change. The new initiative included mandatory bias training for all staff, from ground crew to executives. The training would focus on recognizing unconscious bias, promoting inclusivity, and ensuring every passenger felt welcome, regardless of their background. The announcement included a nod to the Thompsons' experience, not by name, but with a story of how a family's grace under pressure had inspired a deeper look at the airline's culture. The CEO himself addressed the staff, his words resonating with sincerity. "We cannot change the past, but we can learn from it. Our goal is to make every flight a safe and respectful experience for all. We owe that not only to our passengers, but to ourselves as a company that values dignity and respect." Jessica attended the first training session. She sat at the front of the room, her notebook open, her pen poised not just to take notes but to listen, to really listen. She knew this was more than a chance to save her job. It was an opportunity to reshape the lens through which she viewed the world. And she was ready, not just to participate, but to transform. The Thompson family moved through the airport with quiet strength. They didn't walk faster or slower than anyone else, but there was a purpose in their steps, a sense of closure. The executives had offered apologies, had shaken David's hand and spoken with Maria, but the true victory lay in how the family held themselves, in the way they moved forward, not defined by what had happened, but by how they had responded. David's hand found Maria's, their fingers intertwining naturally. The camera, if it had been there, would have caught the quiet power of that gesture, a symbol of unity and resilience. Ella skipped beside them, her toy airplane still in hand, its colorful wings catching the light. She was as carefree as ever, her innocence intact, a testament to the strength of her parents' love and guidance. As they approached the exit, a passerby who had recognized them from the news hesitated, then offered a soft, "Thank you." David nodded, acknowledging the sentiment with a quiet grace. They didn't need validation, but they accepted it as a sign that the story had reached beyond them, touching lives, stirring thoughts, sparking change. Outside, the world awaited, broad and open, filled with possibilities. The Thompson family stepped through the sliding doors into the sunlight, their path clear, their dignity unshaken, and their story a quiet, powerful reminder that true strength often speaks in whispers, and that even the smallest voices can help shift the tide. The screen softened to black, and slowly, white letters appeared, their simplicity underscoring the power of the message. Respect is not a privilege, it is a right. When will we see each other for who we truly are? The words lingered, allowing the weight of the story to settle. The quiet after the narrative wasn't empty. It was filled with the echoes of everything unspoken. Questions, reflections, a gentle urging for the viewer to look inward. The narrator's voice returned, softer now, resonating with empathy. Stories like this aren't just meant to be heard, they're meant to be shared. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it reminded you of a moment when you felt unseen, or inspired you to stand with someone who was, pass it on. Real change begins with real stories, and every share is a step toward understanding. The visuals shifted to a soft montage of everyday moments. Diverse faces in everyday spaces, people connecting, helping, lifting each other up. The images weren't grand or staged, but beautifully ordinary, showing that respect and kindness often lived in the quietest acts. Instead of a bold, flashing prompt to subscribe, the message unfolded gently. We believe in the power of stories, to shine a light on truth, to inspire change, to build bridges where there were once walls. If you'd like to hear more, if you're ready for stories that make you feel and think and grow, stay with us. You won't want to miss what's next. The screen faded to a final, simple image. The toy airplane, its bright colors vivid against a soft blue sky, a symbol of hope and forward movement. The closing notes of a soft piano melody played, carrying the story to a quiet, thoughtful end. There was no rush, no push, just an invitation, a door left open, a path laid gently, waiting for those ready to take the next step, not just as viewers, but as voices in the ongoing story of change. As the final notes of the soft piano melody faded, the screen remained still for a moment, allowing the story's impact to settle. Then, gently, new words appeared, their tone not commanding but inviting. If this story touched your heart, consider sharing it with someone who needs to hear it. Every story shared is a step toward a world where respect is not asked for, but given freely. The message flowed naturally, woven into the narrative's fabric, not as a call to action, but as an extension of the story's purpose. The suggestion to like, share, and subscribe wasn't just about growing an audience. It was about growing a movement. Stay with us, the narrator's voice returned, warm and hopeful. For more stories that lift the veil, that open eyes and hearts. Each story is a chance to see the world through a new lens, to walk in someone else's shoes. And together, story by story, we can create a world where everyone's dignity is recognized and respected. The screen shifted to a soft, looping animation of the toy airplane from Ella's hands, its bright wings catching the sunlight as it soared against a clear blue sky. It wasn't just a toy, it was a symbol of hope, of the journeys we take not only through the air but through life, learning and growing with every step. There was no hard stop, no abrupt end. just an open horizon, an invitation to continue forward, to be part of the change, to add your voice to the story. It left the viewer with a feeling not of an ending, but of a beginning. Because the most powerful stories don't close chapters, they open doors.